When we think of Jesus' public life, we might ask the question, when was he most in need of a friend? When was it that a few loyal disciples might have meant the most to Jesus? When in his public ministry did Jesus feel most alone, abandoned? Chances are we have visited these questions in our own prayer. Today the gospel proposes answers. The rulers sneered, we are told. The soldiers jeered. A criminal crucified beside him reviled him. The crowd was silent. All this as a sign hung just inches above his head, proclaiming him to be the King of the Jews. This week, a year of grace concludes. We acknowledge Christ's kingship over us and over all we have been about this year. In that first reading from the second book of Samuel, we see the elders of the northern tribes of Israel come to David in Hebron. David had already been anointed to lead the southern tribes. And the northern tribes, now that Saul has died, seek a king. The northern tribes are aware that David had led their armies out and won victory for Saul in years past. The northern tribes are aware that David had married one of Saul's daughters, and so they approach the conqueror, David, and ask him to reign over them as their king. And so David asks them to anoint him as king, and the 12 tribes are united under his leadership against the enemies that threatened them. In these political and governmental machinations of long ago, we see God's hand reigning over his chosen people. And so it is in our time, this year of grace, that we conclude God still reigns over all that happens, over us, his people. And in the second reading, as Paul wrote to the Colossians, that high-blown, all-embracing theology of who Christ is for us, his disciples, this theology that he presented to the early church applies to us now. Christ reigns as king over theologians here at Notre Dame and in our church and world. He presides and reigns over us all, his church. In the gospel, we see Luke reminding us that Christ reigns over all aspects of our human condition, divine and human. There on the cross, he reigns over a different sort of kingdom for sure than the world judges, but there is Christ reigning, as he still does, over all, human and divine, in our makeup. Every dimension of who we are belongs to the kingship of Christ. In the tangles and in the complexities of our daily lives, as well as in the consolations and in the triumphs of what we are about every day as his disciples, we seek a path that leads to Jesus, to his ruling over our lives. We, as human beings, have an amazing capacity. We have an awesome capacity. We have a wonderful capacity, a capacity to receive God. and we seek to receive him, all his blessings, all his sacraments. God comes to us in countless ways. Our openness to him must never be compromised. We seek to receive our God in all we're about. When we sincerely ask someone how they are doing and pause to listen intently, don't we demonstrate our capacity to receive God? And when we come to realize that the person who is a pain in our neck or a cross that we may feel like we have to bear, when we think in those terms, as perhaps we do, and then we move beyond that to realize that that person may be carrying the real cross, just living the life that they've been given may be the real cross. Then, when we understand this, we demonstrate our capacity to receive God. And when we pardon someone who has disappointed us or even betrayed us, we demonstrate the capacity to receive God. Jesus exercises his kingship over all people repeatedly in the Gospels. And here on the cross, he does so again as he pardons even his enemies. What Jesus said and did throughout Scriptures, he says and does today. He will always say and do. As regards pardon, his pardon is limitless. His reign has begun over all who turn to him. Accepting his pardon, turning to him in humility and in gratitude, as we do as a nation this week of Thanksgiving, relying on him rather than on our own resources. When we do these things, this is our capacity to receive God at its best. This brings us to Jesus, abandoned there on the cross, the time when he was most alone, most in need of a friend. Then we are there. Rather than sneer and jeer and revile, as many might when we see the Lord in that condition, we step up and ask that it may always be thus, because it is in the cross, in the resurrection of Jesus, that we find our hope, our King reigning over all.